Chapter 4, Topic 4.5, the Helminthes. The worms. Discussing organisms that are, relatively speaking, closely related to humans is a good way to end the section on eukaryotes. We'll be talking about general worm morphology, life cycles, and reproduction. We're going to use an example of a worm life cycle. We're going to use schistostoma instead of the pinworm. And we're going to talk about distribution and importance of parasitic worms. At the end of this recorded lecture, you should be able to list the two major groups of Helminthes and then the two subgroups of one of these groups and a typical Helminth life cycle. Worms are animals. By that, I mean they have all the characteristics of an animal, not that you would not necessarily want to keep one as a pet. All animals, from worms to frisbee-catching dogs to frisbee-throwing humans, are eukaryotic. Their cells don't have cell walls, and they are multicellular. After that, there is less resemblance between invertebrates like worms and vertebrates like dogs and humans. Helminthes come in two main groups, the roundworms or nematodes and flatworms. Flatworms are divided into the trematodes and the cestoids. Most nematodes are completely non-pathogenic and in fact are vital to the proper functioning of the planet. Some of our oldest and best friends are nematodes, but because they are slimy and wiggly, they get a bad rap. Well, and some nematodes do cause serious disease. I'll let you read up on them in the table at the end of the presentation. There were fewer non-pathogenic flatworms, and none of them, so far as I know, are old friends. Of the parasitic flatworms, the trematodes are the flukes, and the cestoids are the tapeworms. Once again, I'll leave you to read up on them in the table later on in the presentation. Helminthes start out as fertilized eggs, or embryos. From there, the embryos develop into larval form, some of which look so different from the adults that for a long time, some of them were thought to be different species. The larva matures into an adult, which produce eggs. I'm not going to make you remember which types have two different sexes like humans, and which are hermaphroditic, or have both types of sex organs, ovaries and testes, in the same worm. The book goes into detail on the life cycle of the pinworm. Make sure you note for the exam, in-class exercises, and if your kids ever bring them home from school. Since the textbook went into it in detail, I'm going to give you another example of a Helminth life cycle, that of the schistostoma genus of trematode flatworms. In my story of the life cycle of schistostoma, don't worry about learning the names of the different stages. Not being a specialist on schistosoma, I don't remember them, and I don't expect you to. Make sure you know the story, though. The schistostoma trematode starts out life as a fertilized egg in an unfortunate human. It is released from the warm, moist, safe environment of the human intestine into the cold, cruel world. In areas where schistostomatitis is a problem, human waste is not treated to remove parasites and pathogens before wastewater is returned to the environment. Be thankful for your local wastewater treatment facility. In the aquatic environment, the egg hatches into a free-living larva that goes in search of its next host, an aquatic snail. Inside the snail, it changes into the next free-living larval stage, which leaves the snails and searches for a human host. It bores through the skin of the feet or the legs of the human, enters the bloodstream, and attempts to find the intestines. Sometimes it misses and hits the bladder or some other organ. There, it matures into an adult. The adults mate and produce an obscene number of fertilized eggs in the hopes that a few will survive and grow up to be adults. In the meantime, the adults hide out from the human immune system, surviving and pumping out fertilized eggs in the human host for decades. Schistostoma is listed by the World Health Organization, or WHO, as the greatest Helminth cause of disease and death in the world. So, how do we prevent this chronic inflammation caused by the schistostoma worm infestation? Well, once you get the disease, it's hard to get rid of it because we don't have fantastic anti-worm agents for it. The best method is prevention. So I want you to think about how you would prevent transmission to the human host. Parasitic worms are found everywhere that humans live. They are generally thought to be more prevalent in tropical areas, but that is the case for only those helminths that require a specific intermediate host between human hosts. And because of climate change and human migration, tropical worms are showing up alongside their temperate pinworm cousins. Such a comforting thought. Well, that's it for this topic and for this chapter. You should now be able to list the two main groups of helminths and then the two subgroups of one of those groups and describe a typical helminth life cycle.